As the clerk announced, this is the time for public comment on Administrative Docket 499. It arises out of an earlier petition to examine certain matters related to the operation of the Board of Continuing Legal Education. As the record in the case shows, the Supreme Court appointed a committee to study the CLE board, whose members would be selected by the Chief Justice, and the committee would be chaired by the Chief Justice. The committee was appointed and conducted numerous meetings. The committee was comprised of representatives of the Board of Governors, representatives from the CLE board, and 3 members of the State Bar at large, including Mr. Becko, Ms. McConnell, and Mr. Mead. On September 15th, the committee filed its report in which it set out its recommendations and included a long-term strategy or business plan that had been requested by the committee of the CLE board during the course of the committee's deliberations. We've had some comments presented to the court by the State Bar and others, and most recently received further input from the Board of Continuing Legal Education on the business plan. So what I would like to do now is call upon those who wish to make further comment or comment about the committee's report or the CLE board's business plan, or any other comment that persons in the public or the members of the bar may have concerning the operation of the continuing legal education process in the state. So with that, maybe the best place to begin would be with Ms. Hubach as the president of the CLE board, if that's appropriate, and then we can just entertain comment from those who wish to offer comment as they choose. Ms. Hubach, thank you for being in Las Vegas today for the presentation. I do want to comment to the court that the CLE board, or the committee I should say, interacted with the CLE board and its staff at great length. We spent, I think, 3+ hours or more in the first meeting with the staff of the Continuing Legal Education Board and received extraordinary input to the extent that anyone may have the perception that that is a group that isn't pretty tested. It's very tested. It's an extraordinary staff with a lot of work to do, and have really come a long ways, I think, in the last year in its operation. And I applaud the efforts of your board, Ms. Hubach, and what they've been able to accomplish in the past year. And we appreciate the dedication of your board and your staff.
Thank you very much, Your Honor.
So go ahead with your observations. Be mindful, all of you, that we have read your materials, so it isn't necessary to completely review page by page or word by word what you've already presented.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the Court, President DeGiusti, past President Lana Hatch, Ms. Farmer, President-elect Brian Scott, Board of Governors, former board member Richard Reitzer. We have our Executive Director Laura Bogdan. We have Mark Sullivan, and we have the pleasure of the U.S. Attorney's Company as well, Dan Bogdan. I also wanted to indicate that in Carson City we have our Vice Chair, Vic Draculich. I believe Frank Flaherty is also present, together with Assistant Executive Director Debbie Russell. Megan Hoffman is also present. She's one of our board members as well, hiding in the back. I also want to take just a brief moment to thank the court very much, especially Chief Justice, for accommodating issues in my life recently and rescheduling this to today. As in any organization, from time to time, a review and introspection must be made in order to move forward and review and make necessary revisions to improve not only the organization itself, but the services that that organization provides to its constituents. This is a stage where we currently are. Out of all the introspection, I think the very best thing, the very best product that has arisen from this has been the finalization of a very detailed business plan provided to this court. While Mr. Sullivan will be addressing that plan in a little more detail, but he will not be reading it to you verbatim, I just want to let this court know that staff worked very closely with Mr. Sullivan along with the board in preparing it based on compilation of data and statistics and a variety of information. We also had wonderful input from the State Bar of Nevada, who, as you see, made an observation as well, and we filed, and I apologize for the last minute reply, it wasn't able to be filed until the 4th. We had a lot of our board members that were stretched to the max trying to deal with their practices, and staff was stressed as well, trying this is a busy time of the year for them. But I do want to acknowledge that they took significant time in making observations, and we did end up incorporating some of those in our final reply to their reply, so we appreciate that. Excuse me. In addition, I just want the court to know that the entire CLE board met and discussed the plan in detail, and we unanimously agreed. So that was also something very positive that came out of this process. Our goal, I think the goal of every one of us here, is to provide good, strong, solid regulation, if you will, and to make sure that the attorneys are in compliance, the public is protected, and that good quality CLE education is provided to our members. As you recall, back in July, ATKT 499 was filed by Brent Adams. Since that time, a great deal has transpired, as the Chief pointed out, in that following that last hearing, the Blue Ribbon Commission was formed. Further vetting was done of our organization, and it's all been very positive and has turned things around in so very many ways. As you also know, the board was created back in '92, and I only bring that up because at its inception, it really needed a whole lot of guidance and help. That's the initial creation. And it was not only the State Bar that guided us, but the court also. We always had a justice as a member. As time progressed, and of course caseloads got bigger and bigger, we ended up with the court somewhat backing off, and we were pretty much independently operated with the sole input from the Board of Governors, and that they appointed our representatives. Back in 2010, then the Chief Justice ordered that a full revamp of the bylaws, regulations were done, and we did that as well in an attempt to increase compliance. Well, as we all know, it increased it a little bit, but what it ended up doing was creating a lot of reserves, which I'm going to get to in just a quick moment. From that point is really where we started to move into the 21st century after the Chief's guidance. Now, one change during that period of time is that we joined the National CLE Regulators Association, and that resulted in us starting to revamp our policies, our procedures, and most importantly, our entire computer system. That was created by the Pennsylvania CLE Board, and while that may seem a little strange, we met these folks at one of the national meetings and learned that they had created a very detailed programming system designed just for CLE boards and systems. And now we are one of 5 other states that have joined on this with PACL, as we call them, Pennsylvania CLE, and there are more states joining. I bring this up because it gave us an opportunity to not only utilize but test an already tried and true organizational data development plan. So we didn't have to go out and reinvent the wheel, which is very important and has saved us a lot of time, money, and energy. It's already resulted in a better office, better efficiency, and better service to our attorney members. It's also, and most importantly, resulted in an online presence where now each and every one of us can jump on, create an account, look at our credits, and more importantly, we can actually go on and see what courses are being offered in our area of practice. And finally, and most recently, you can now get online and pay your dues. So we are really moving forward to the 21st century. And it's the first time since 1982. In addition, this year, new compliance reports were sent out in accordance with our new computer system. And as with anything new, changes and modifications have been needed. Ms. Bogdan, our executive director, has already begun making some changes so that they are more user-friendly, based on comments that we received and input from our constituents. In fact, this Friday, our board is going to meet for our December board meeting, and that is one of the items on the agenda, is to make sure that the newly generated forms of compliance are more user-friendly, so that everybody can understand what it is, what credits they have, what credits are coming up to fall off, and what credits they need for the future. All in all, we're trying to become totally paperless. It is the board's intention in that regard to file an ADKT, depending upon the outcome of the business plan, requesting revision to Supreme Court Rule 210. That rule currently requires each attorney to sign the actual compliance form, paper, and mail it back to our office. Now, with about 8,500 active attorneys, you can imagine how much paper that is, how much staff time that causes, and how expensive it is. So if we are able to move another step forward towards paperless, we would be asking the court to allow for an electronic signature to make it even easier for the attorneys to comply. Another recent change that we had was we recently added 2 full-time staff members. With that having been said, we envisioned that, and we are told, and based on our analysis, we believe this would be more than sufficient staff should we be able to move forward and implement the new business plan for the sponsor fee product. Now, the other question, of course, is initially the ADKT 499 came about because of the question, who would oversee the CLE board? And as if you recall the last public hearing we had, we argued very vehemently for the court to be our overseer. And it's my understanding that the Blue Ribbon Commission has come to that conclusion as well. So I just briefly want to touch on a couple of reasons why that request was made to begin with. There are currently 25 states that are under the direction of their Supreme Courts. Only 16 remain under the direction of their state bars. Of those 16, there is a current move by many to become separate entities under their Supreme Courts because they feel there exists an inherent conflict of interest having the regulatory authority being regulated by a CLE provider. Now, there are 5 states that have no CLE requirements, no mandatory. Also, on a side note, we learned at the last national meeting that Europe was moving to a self-regulating version of CLE. A little bit frightening, but interesting. Having said that, the bottom line is the board is moving forward and has significantly approved its service to members with the institutional knowledge that we have from our executive director and assistant executive director, each of whom have more than 20 plus years of experience. We are now moving to a point where they can place that knowledge into other staff members. We now have full cross-training. And by that I mean this. If anything were to happen to any one of them, including our executive director or assistant, we'd be able to keep moving forward without skipping a beat. Now, with respect to cooperation with the State Bar, this has also been a very good experience because we conducted a meeting not too long ago with the State Bar of Nevada, and at that meeting was myself. We had board member Frank Flaherty, executive director Laura Bogdan, Justin Williams, our IT specialist. We had President Larry DeGesti. We had Kim Farmer, the executive director, and Deputy Executive Director Lisa Dreitzer. We discussed many areas of interest and determined what operations could, if any, be combined to prevent any duplication of efforts. And I recall that was a question that the court had of us at the last public hearing. We learned a couple of things. One was having a joint mailing would be nearly impossible at this point only because of the deadlines that are set forth within our Supreme Court rules that dictate our timing elements. However, having said that, if in fact this business plan is successful and we get rid of the $40 annual fee, then there would be no reason to have a mailing at all. And of course, we get rid of the compliance report that has to be signed and mailed in paper. Then there would be no need to have a mailing. And that issue would be resolved. Now, of course, we could bring forth an ADKT and have the court change around our timing, and then that way we could do a group mailing every year. In addition, we discussed website links. And by that, I mean being able to get on our website and click on an icon where you can get right to the State Bar, and vice versa. And I'm very pleased to announce to this court that as of now, we do have a little icon on there with the State Bar logo. When you come onto our website, you can click on that, and it'll take you right to the State Bar's website. Another item that we discussed during that meeting is the State Bar offered to provide all of their email addresses of their members, because that's something that we have never really gathered. And that was very productive. Ms. Lisa Dreitzer provided those to us. They are now entered into our system, and that is another step closer to becoming paperless, because now we will be sending out notifications via email, reminding people you only have 30 days and you're 10 credits behind, those types of things, reminding them to get their dues paid until, of course, we get rid of that $40 fee, which is our hope. Again, over time, this will save great money for postage, processing costs, and personnel. The State Bar also offered assistance with our preparation of ADKTs for rule changes, which will be required should we end up with the fees or sponsored fee-based plan. Excuse me. As you can see, the board and the CLE staff are working closely. We're trying to work with the State Bar of Nevada because we want to work together as opposed to apart. By working together, our boards can be very, very effective. And having the oversight from this honorable court will make it even more productive. We'll be able to operate as a separate and independent agency free of any conflicts, be it real or perceived, as we are regulators and the State Bar of Nevada is a provider. It is in this way that we can continue to move forward and become better and better. While some don't like change, change can very much be a blessing. And while this process has been at times been challenging, it has been of great benefit. So we'd ask you to allow us to continue on this positive and productive plan, overseeing our operations, appointing our members, and maintaining a separation of entities, and continue, though, to have a liaison from the Board of Governors, because that has been critical in terms of keeping the flow of information and the communication and the cooperation moving both ways. And we also would suggest a liaison from the Supreme Court to maintain that same sense of flow of information. We want to make sure that there's an open line of communication at all times between the CLE Board, the State Bar of Nevada, and the Nevada Supreme Court. Being overseen, working along side by side with the Bar in furtherance of our mission, which again is to ensure compliance, ensure and maintain quality of CLE provided to our attorneys, protect the community, and protect our lawyers, is the goal of everyone involved, and I'm sure everyone in this room. Now I would briefly like to address an issue that seems prevalent in the letters which were submitted to the court for today's consideration. One, I just want to be very clear that the board has no intention whatsoever of charging any nonprofit agencies that are offering free CLE to attorneys any fees of any kind. So the $5 credit fee is not applicable. The $500 yearly fee is also not applicable, so long as they are not charging the attorneys for profit. We also have no intention in any way, shape, or form of charging any entity that provides CLE in exchange for an attorney taking a pro bono case. That simply would not be fair to the provider or to the attorney, in our humble opinion. I hope that those comments have clarified a bit of perhaps what may be confusion, and hopefully will put those agencies' minds at ease. And Chief Justice, you had previously indicated a desire to try and create a system whereby we could make sure our attorneys are being educated in their area of practice. Because as we all know, there's so many that end up this month, of course, it's our highest CLE month of the year, just grasping for CLEs to be compliant. And say a criminal defense lawyer, all they can find is an estate planning. So they take it. So how is that really pursuing our mission in benefiting and educating lawyers and protecting the public? It's really not. Unfortunately, we presented this question in Chicago at the last national meeting, and everyone in that room said they couldn't do it. I'm one of these people that believes that nothing is impossible. There's got to be a way to do it, but I think we're at a point we need more research, more development, trying to come up with some ideas, brainstorming on how to do it, because nothing can be impossible. One suggestion would be perhaps, and again, this needs more research and vetting, would be to add to the State Bar forms. You include your area of practice. That is reported to the CLE board, who then inputs it, monitors the compliance programs or forms, and when we see that someone in criminal defense is taking estate planning, we say, hey, you're not in compliance. And that would take a Supreme Court rule as well. So just something for thought and to let the court know that we have been discussing it, trying to figure out some way to make that happen. And it will be a difficult task, and there will be a lot more work to be done. Now, as to reserves. While Mr. Sullivan will be addressing this issue, I just want to point out that our board is very much in favor of donating any excess proceeds in the reserves to nonprofits. And our only hesitation at this point is because with any new business plan, we have to be very fiscally responsible, make sure that we're not overreaching, because once that, if we were to take all the reserves away today, for example, and we start this new program next year with fee-based sponsors, we're going to leave the $40 in for the first year anyway. But then after that first year, that $40 is gone, and that's a significant amount of revenue. Then we have to look back and say, uh-oh, we didn't keep enough reserves for operating. So, and Mr. Sullivan's going to point out what he believes based on his full analysis is how much he thinks that we should keep and how much at this point we could actually provide to the court for donation purposes in any way the court may see fit. I just want to point that out because the board certainly is not in opposition to that. And, quite frankly, a lot of those reserves came from non-compliant attorneys over the years. In conclusion, we urge that this court allow us and adopt the business plan, I would say as modified in the last one filed on December 4th, which includes quite a few of the suggestions from the State Bar. Let us get started and see where we go with all of this, and then come back and reevaluate after we've given it a year and test it. I think I've outlined our ideas for essentially we're trying to do a one-stop shop, but without trying to unravel and cause a whole lot of consternation and a whole lot more ADKTs and create a lot more work for the court. I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but we are ready, willing, and able to get started. So I very much, again, want to thank you for your time and your attention, and I hope together the court, the State Bar, and the CLE Board can accomplish our mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schubach. I did want to mention, I should have at the beginning of the hearing, Justice Douglas had a meeting that was in conflict, and he's not present, but he will be obviously participating in the deliberations on this particular subject when the court conferences on it, and he'll listen to the tape of the presentations that are made today. Are there any questions from the justices of Ms. Schubach?
I do, Ms. Schubach. First of all, I want to congratulate the State Bar, Kim and Larry, and of course the CLE Board for this line of communication that's been open. I was in the middle of some of the controversy, and I'm glad to see. I wish you were all sitting together instead of separately. It reminds me of Orthodox Judaism. The women are on one side, the men are on the other. So we have the State Bar over here and the CLE over here. Jenny and I go back to Client Security Fund when you were very young, and I was just middle-aged at the time. So I've known you a long time, and I know you're really dedicated to this. Did you provide in the business plan for some type of retirement program? I remember talking to you and to some of the CLE staff members about the fact there was a lack of any type of retirement program for the long-time employees. What's the status of that, Ms. Schubach?
That has been resolved and settled. Ms. Debbie Russell and Ms. Laura Bogdan have been compensated for accumulated sick time that was they wouldn't have received anything. And so we use that to try and compensate them for the differentiation between having no retirement but then now having the SEP IRA. So every year we do make contributions, so there is a good retirement plan in place.
And also, what's the issue with those of us who are over 70? What's that in your business plan? I've had a nice year of not having to do CLE, even though I did it, but I know there's a lot of my contemporaries from the early years in the Bar Association, State Bar Association, that did not do CLE since they are exempt. What's the position of the State Bar and the CLE Board on that? Since that's my constituency now.
I apologize, Your Honor. That is one issue that the board has not yet discussed, but I will tell you that I, as a board member, along with our staff that have attended the national meetings, there is a drive to up that age limit. Being that, knock on wood, we are living longer, just because you're 70 doesn't mean you do not need to be educated. And I think I can safely say that the board would agree with that.
Well, just to hope that you take the right strides to make sure that it's fair to those who have not done CLE for a number of years because they've been exempt.
Oh, of course. We would never make it retroactive and say you have to do 100 units because you didn't do it.
But also proper notice where it doesn't take effect, if you pass something in January, it doesn't take effect that year, maybe the next year.
Exactly.
Thank you for those of us who are now exempt.
Thank you, Justice.
Only for a little while, Justice Gibbons.
Yes, thank you, Chief. Jenny, I know the Chief's been keeping us advised of the progress of this committee, and we're all very happy about it, with the State Bar and the CLA Board working together and all to resolve some of these past issues. It did come up, though, the Chief reported to us about some of this buildup of reserves is based upon penalties and fees paid by attorneys that don't do their CLE on time, but I wasn't aware of the fact that you can be reinstated just by paying these penalties, but you don't have to do the CLE, so it's almost like you kind of buy your way out of the CLE that most of us do and do it on time. So has there been any discussion, and I assume that would be in conjunction with the State Bar, about whether that policy should be changed?
Yes, our board has discussed that, and we wholeheartedly agree that paying your way out of it is not going to work. You're going to have to pay the money, and you're going to have to do the CLEs.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions of Ms. Schubach by members of the court? Okay, Ms. Schubach, thank you for your summary and your report here today.
Thank you very much, Your Honor.
You're more than welcome to come back and address any other comments after you've heard others offer presentations, and I appreciate your clarification about the application of the business plan and its fee structure to nonprofits and other organizations.
Thank you very much, Your Honor.
Mr. Sullivan?
Good afternoon, Justices of the Court. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. I'm going to address 5 topics. These are, first, describing the methodology that went into putting together the business plan, both the written plan itself as well as the financial model that goes with it. Then I'll talk about a few of the significant outcomes very briefly because I do not want to repeat what's been in the business plan. Thirdly, I'd like to share with you what I believe are the biggest risks from a financial perspective in particular for this business plan. Next, I want to address the reserves, as Ms. Schubach has suggested, from a financial perspective also. I'll make some recommendations related to both the reserves and the risks once those have been covered. And then finally, I'll make some concluding remarks. To begin with the methodology, I'll start with the principles, then talk about the component steps, and then talk about the model in particular. Principles that we applied throughout the process are integration, iteration, and a sustainable financial foundation. By integration, I mean making sure that the various components of the business plan, the strategies, tie together and are consistent with each other as opposed to being contradictory. We want a holistic business plan coming out of this. Iteration simply means doing it over and over and over again. We go through the process that I'm about to describe, and we repeat portions of it as we go. When we get to the financial model discussion, I'll talk about some principles specific to that approach as well. I'll list off the components of the process without a lot of detail underneath them. These will come across sequentially, but again, these bounce back and forth, iterate between them. So the 9 steps are typically, first, start with the constituencies. Who are they? Attorneys, program providers, the Supreme Court, Blue Ribbon Commission, State Bar, the Board of NVCLE, and the staff. Second, we talk through the existing business model to understand its strengths and its shortcomings and what we could learn from those. It's particularly important that I understand how that works, since much of that will carry over into the new plan. Third, from those steps, designing the objectives. What are the objectives that we want to accomplish with a new business plan? Then from there, gathering the inputs, data, qualitative input from constituencies, and that sort of thing. Fifth is the design of the new business model, starting conceptually, and then as we iterate through it, becoming more and more specific and more refined. Next is the drafting component that begins. A key aspect of the drafting is to make sure we can capture the concepts we're after on paper. And often, the discipline of drafting that forces you to realize that there are aspects that maybe aren't right, or could be improved, or aren't going to work. We do the same with the financial model. As drafting occurs, we're building a financial model. Again, because those tie together, we want to be able to see that the financial model structure ties with the plan, and that also will elicit aspects that maybe need to be improved or changed. The iteration I mentioned is the next step, which I call refinement. And again, this is basically repeating the steps that I've already described several times. And then finally, within this process, we were provided with some very good feedback from a number of outside sources. So I'll now turn to the financial model and talk a little bit about that specifically. At the conceptual level, it seems pretty straightforward. There are a number of attorneys, there are 12 credit hours required, there are fees for noncompliance, there's the annual fee. When you dig down underneath it, it becomes a very, very complex model. This is because of a significant number of variables that go into this, which then becomes order of magnitudes more possible permutations of those variables. So for example, there are 11 compliance or non-compliance paths that an attorney can go down through the NVCLE process, with different fees imposed at different times. There are 4 non-compliance categories around those fees. There are 4 categories of providers. There are 3 sources of credit hour fees. There are 2 sources of program application fees, and on and on. So it becomes very complex with the number of permutations. And what this underscores are the key principles of building a financial model like this. The first principle is to build from the bottom up. Start with assumptions and build up to the outputs. Hand in hand with that is the concept of granularity, where we try to get down to the most basic elemental assumptions that then flow upward. What that does is give you the flexibility to adjust. So a couple of the many, many examples that I could give are compliance levels. It has been designed and structured so that for any year, for any one of those 11 paths, we can vary the assumptions of what we think compliance might be. As far as non-compliance fees go, we can change any of the fees to any amount, and we can change the time periods in which they are assessed. Two additional principles relating to the financial model. One I've touched on or alluded to, which is we do assumptions first and then output. We do not try to decide what we want the output to be and then build the assumptions toward that output. And this occurs at each iteration as well. If we need to adjust, refine assumptions, we go through that exercise without looking at what it does to the output until those adjustments have been made. The second principle around this is that we err low on the side of revenues and we err high on the side of expenses. So again, just to walk through the process for both the written part and the financial model: assumptions, assess the output, adjust, refine, repeat until we arrive at a final product. As far as the structure of the model itself, the basic building blocks, we have two revenues models. One works for the existing business model, the other is for the new provider funding model, with the ability to vary the changeover date. When do we switch from one to the other? We have two non-recurring cost modules. One is for the PACL development work, one-time work they will do on the systems to implement from their end, and one for NVCLE, and what needs to be done one-time basis to implement from this end.
I'm not clear on the report and how the fees, the source of revenue works. And what I'm looking at is the September 15 report of the study committee and the appendix to it at pages 22 through pretty much 28. It's the historical financial results and the projected financial results. Can you, particularly looking at page 25, do you have that there?
I do not have it in front of me, but I have
Okay,
pretty
if you
good
could walk
recollection.
through an overview of what are the components of the revenue going forward as anticipated and how that differs from historical revenue source, that would be helpful to me.
Certainly. In the existing model, there's the $40 annual fee, and there are the non-compliance fees: extension fee, late fee, dismissal fee, reinstatement fee. Those are the sources of revenues under the current model. The objective of the new model is to substantially shift the funding to those who benefit from providing the programs, so the providers. The fees that are generated under the new model come from a per credit hour fee assessed principally on providers and a program application fee also assessed on the providers. There are some exceptions. There are certain categories of both accredited and non-accredited providers that are exempt from fees. And there are also certain application and credit hour fees where the situation is that the attorney would be responsible for those costs. Over the course of the model, the fees get shifted substantially from the attorneys to the providers, and it's elected by attorneys if they're going to programs outside of the approved list with NVCLE, then they would make the choice to pay the application fee and the credit hour fee. Otherwise, those fees are all paid by providers. There are a couple of other categories of income from providers. Those are fairly small dollar amounts. They're for new providers applying to become accredited. Therefore, an annual fee, renewal fee we call it, and there's a couple other small ones. But the predominant sources are the credit hour fees and the application fees paid by providers. The other large but diminishing source of income overall are the non-compliance fees from attorneys. Those fees under this business model increase substantially,
Yeah, they do.
and as a result of that, those fees go up initially, and then as compliance improves, they come down over time.
It seems like a very hefty assumption on those non-compliance fees.
Assumptions as to the fee levels themselves, or
Yes,
the
yes. Can you explain that?
those came about from internal discussion amongst the chair and the staff of NBCLE. Those also are structured in the model so that any of those can be changed.
Okay.
Well, there is a pretty substantial history, is there not, of non-compliant individuals. So
Yes.
there's a baseline of non-compliant individuals. You're just raising the price for non-compliance.
That's correct. The objective being to drive higher compliance. In fact, when you look at the results of the model, by the outer years of the model, the income from attorneys, 93% of that is coming from non-compliant attorneys, which, as I see it, it should be. If attorneys are non-compliant, they should be the ones picking up the load for what attorneys are paying in this model.
Where on the, and maybe I'm just missing it, where are the non-compliance fees currently shown in the historical financial results data? Is that in the number of annual dues or extension fees? What is it?
In the historical financial results for years prior to the current staff, those categories were not broken out in the books of NBCLE to the level of specificity that we use going forward. Generally speaking, those are the extension fees, late fees, dismissal, reinstatement fees. In fact, again, I don't have that in front of me, but I believe that they're all lumped as one number until 2014 when they're broken out more specifically.
Well, yeah, there's late fees, but they're $9,900 in 2014. So you're looking at increase in attorney's fee on this. The attorneys will be funding this by a substantial increase in fees is what you're projecting.
The non-compliant attorneys will be funding, I believe at the beginning of the new model, it's about 32% of revenues perhaps. I may be confusing that.
I don't want to detract from your performance.
Yeah.
I was just trying to understand these charts because they're not, you're right, they're not broken out prior, so I'm trying to.
And also in the projections, there's the summary projected results, which do not break it down into as much detail.
Yeah, they don't. They're
The
kind of opaque.
the actual projections break it down into further detail. The model itself breaks it down even further, but at some point it started to become burdensome, I thought, in terms of the number of line items that we might be showing you. So, for example, in the projected results, I believe there's a category called non-compliance fees, and those are late dismissal and reinstatement fees bundled together. In the model itself, those are each determined individually based on specific assumptions for those types of fees.
Well,
And why, and looking at the expense side of it, you're going from total expenses historically 2014 of $533,000 to projected expenses in 2016 of over $1 million. So that's a doubling of the expenses, and I'm not clear on what will be different that justifies that doubling.
2016 is the transition year, so it includes all of the one-time costs. The software development and implementation costs for the new system, license fees, support fees, and related things there. There are also some one-time expenses that NBCLE incurs in terms of notifications to attorneys about the new program and responsibilities that they have under the new business model.
But going forward, they still are up around $900 to $1 million in 2020, so they have this model significantly increases the expenses even beyond the one-time for 2016. Can you give me a general explanation of what accounts for that?
Sure. A portion of it is the ongoing license fees and support fees to PACL, which have not existed in the past. A portion of it is the payroll and benefits for the staff. To the Justice's earlier question about retirements, there are some other factors that the board considered related to staff in there as well. Provisions for raises, for example. Not large numbers on those, but those are the primary components.
What are the licensing fees? Are those associated with the computers or what?
It's for the software that PACL develops. It's common practice to pay development fees, and then once the software is in operation, pay an annual license fee to continue to use the system and have them administer the system. There's also the component of support fees, which is staff at NBCLE needs assistance with something related to the system. They have a certain amount of free support, and then once they exceed that bucket, they begin paying for it. So that also is a common structure that's built in as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
On page 22 of the plan, you have historical financial results for 2010 through 2014. In 2010, as an example, of a total revenue of $505,000, $216,000 of that was extension fees, almost a little over 40%. And that is the fees that are Justice Gibbons' question related to. Lawyers who haven't met their CLE and are paying late fees, dismissal fees, reinstatement fees, which have been high and elevated a little bit, but under the business plan, they're going to be elevated significantly. Is that right?
Correct. Yes. And that's that discussion amongst staff and the board for those fee levels with the purpose of driving compliance.
Okay. And the category that's on this financial statement of extension fees captures those various fees that we're talking about.
There are actually 4 different types of fees. The extension fees apply to an attorney who has not completed the 12 credit hours by December 31st, can pay an extension fee and complete them by March 1st. Late fees kick in if they haven't completed by March 1st. The dismissal fees kick in at the point an attorney goes on to a petition for dismissal, and the reinstatement fee would come into effect when an attorney is I don't know your technical term for it, but has to be reinstated as a practicing attorney.
Now, my understanding when the committee addressed this is that even though the board hadn't broken down the dollar amounts, they had the staff had specific numbers of lawyers in each of these categories.
We do, yes.
And that formed the basis of the number that was used to calculate the fees going forward.
That's correct. In fact, that was a starting point in terms of compliance. I mentioned the 11 different possible paths, and we looked at the data for each of those paths and where they have been over the last 3 years, and then used that to formulate the starting point for 2016, and then taking the assumptions forward from there.
Okay. I don't know if there are any other questions. If not, you can continue.
I do have a question, and it may be somewhere, and I'm just missing it. The historical results break down the expenses that have been incurred, not very detailed, but somewhat detailed, to rent, computers, payroll, travel, they're all line items. But the projected ones don't. They just give me a lump operating expenses. Is there any place in this report that gives me a breakdown of the operating expenses? The only breakout under the expense heading, in the projected financial is development costs, recurring costs, and implementation expenses, which in the grand scheme of this are fairly nominal, no more than 20% or even just 10% of the total. So the other 90% I don't have a breakdown on. Is there one somewhere in this report?
There is.
Where is it?
I believe you're looking at the summary projected results.
I am.
The final 3 pages are the projected financial results. The
I don't
last-
see the breakdown for the expenses.
It should be the very last portion of the output. It should say operating expenses, and there are about 10 or 12 line items there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
I left off leading into what I see as the biggest risks going forward in this business plan. There are 3 that I'll refer to. One is what I call timing shifts. The second is the concept of institutionalizing knowledge. And the third is complexity. I'll come back to that along the lines I've talked about before. The time shifts deserve some detailed explanation here. The dynamics of the way the NVCLE works are that there are 2 compressed phases. One is late in the year when the bulk of credit hours are earned. The other is early in the carryover year, the following year, which is when the bulk of non-compliance and therefore non-compliance fees are paid. So you have an effect late in the year on credit hour fees, early the following year in terms of the penalty fees. So currently in the model, we're assuming that there's a changeover to the new model in the end of July of 2016. So what that means is under the new model, we capture credit hour fees for most of 2016 because most of those credits are earned after August. Similarly, let me step back. So what that means is if there's a delay in implementation to say the end of the year, that would be a significant amount of revenue from those credit hour fees that would be foregone. It's not lost, it's just shifted out in time, but while it's shifted out, the expenses are occurring to develop and implement the new system. In the early part of the following year, let's say it shifted to the April-May timeframe, there could be another significant chunk of income which would have been collected under the new model based on the higher non-compliance fees that also would be shifted out. So that takes me to the topic of reserves and how I look at reserves. I really see 2 phases to the reserve question. The first is a more broad cushion or contingency phase. It's before the changeover to the new model reaches a steady state where there's real data on how compliance is trending, which providers have remained in the state or left the state, which providers have changed from being non-accredited to accredited, how many attorneys have decided to take courses from providers that will pay for their applications and credit hour fees. So there's all of those variables coming in. So I would advocate for a cushion or contingency period where there's an opportunity to see how those sort out. The second phase I refer to as the policy phase, where once that data from a steady state operation is known, can be assessed, that then a policy can be developed in terms of this is how it'll be done year to year going forward, with room for exceptions, obviously. So the way I've looked at this is that in terms of the cushion, my best estimate would be that it might take 2 collection cycles. So 2000, change over the new model, mid to late 2016. First collection cycle, non-compliance, would be in 2017, second in 2018. So I would think that by 2018, we could be looking at more of a policy-based decision on how reserves are handled. During that first phase of what I'm calling the cushion phase, in looking at the worst-case scenario where, for the time risk, it gets pushed out to April, May of the following year. So we get both the credit hour fees and the non-compliance fees that are foregone for a period of time. That impact could be in the neighborhood of $400,000. So there are a couple other things that could factor into that. There are implementation costs. We've budgeted for overruns of 10%. I think it's possible with the number of permutations that we've been talking about that if there were to be additional increases, it would probably come from being sure that all that data is being handled effectively. And then also,
Do you have a sense of how many of these non-compliant attorneys who will be paying fees that fund this are going to say, I'd rather just toss in my Nevada law license, and they'll prove to be a collection problem going forward? I mean, one of the things that strikes me when we get these not CLE, but bar discipline, many of them have become CLE non-compliant. So if you're just running those numbers, often if a person gives up on their law practice or their law license, they've also given up on their CLE. And so is it realistic? Are you factoring in that a lot of these non-compliers are never going to pay their fee because they're just going to give up?
yes, that is one of the paths that an attorney
Okay.
can go down.
And you've done that off the data that you have?
The data for the starting point for where we start, and then as time goes forward, assumptions around how compliance will ramp up, and within compliance ramping up, which in the 11 different paths, how those...
It seems to me that would not be an ideal funding resource in terms of dependability.
Yes, and I can address that a different way, which is we've looked at sensitivity analysis. Where does income decline to in terms of compliance, where the smaller amount of non-compliance fees, where does that reach break even with expenses? And it's at about a 97% compliance level. So, and that varies depending on which year you assume that you get to that level. But more or less what we're saying is that if we start to approach 95, 96, 97% non-compliance, compliance, that's when you'd have to really begin looking at that impact on lower income and therefore what's going to happen to the net income. Does that make sense?
Yes, what I'm thinking about are the fees going to become so draconian that it's a disincentive to lawyers who aren't wildly successful to bother to continue to practice.
That's beyond my scope, I believe.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, but we do provide for a path for attorneys who opt.
Yes,
To not comply.
I understand, and thank you. I don't mean to derail this.
Okay,
I'm
no.
sorry.
So your recommendation is to shorten the contingency phase by commencing with the new plan as soon as reasonably practicable, and the recommendation is July 1,
In the model, we have July 31st.
or July 31st.
Yes, and staff has talked with PACL, and we believe that there's time between now and then to implement the plan. But the recommendation around that certainly would be to get going as soon as can be done.
Okay.
I believe I've covered the recommendations related to reserves. Chief Justice, you just brought up the mitigating the time shift risk by getting started expeditiously. I believe it makes sense to keep open options relating to various fee levels. For example, I hope this won't sound heretical, but we have the $40 fee continuing for 2016. The model would indicate we do not need that for 2017, but that or a portion of that could be a way to help if there is some kind of time delay that affects income. And so just keeping those options open. I think there's also the possibility of partially implementing the new plan. For example, higher non-compliance fees aren't particularly tied to whether the PACL system has been implemented or not. Those increases or partial increases along the way could be utilized along the way as well. As far as non-compliance or increasing compliance levels, again, I think it's a matter of watching what the trends are, working on real data, and then adjusting as needed. It may be important to point out that in this model, all of the fees, once they come into play, credit hour fees, application fees, non-compliance fees, are held constant through the course of the model. So that's 5 years of constant pricing. I don't think it would be unreasonable to say that pricing increases are doable during the course of 5 years. May not be necessary, but I'll point that out because those fee levels are held flat throughout. I also think that the board would be and should be continually surveying the technology landscape, other CLE organizations around the country for technology or other methods that can help with costs as well. Finally, I'd also recommend an annual update and adjusting the model based, again, on the actual data that's occurred during the prior year. So we can continue that process of iteration and refinement based on actual data that starts to come in under the new model. As my first concluding remark, I have to thank the chair and staff of NVCLE. It was apparent to me very quickly that they have very strong passion for what they do, and they're committed to the purpose of CLE. They have very good knowledge of the rules and regulations and were extremely helpful in walking me through many things that I didn't understand on the first try or second try or third try. They brought that to this project. They were accessible, including on evenings and weekends. They were quickly responsive, and they devoted many hours. I'd also like to thank the Board of Directors of NVCLE for their active role, the State Bar for its input, and again, the court and this forum to be able to present to you. I'll conclude by describing the rigor that was put into this business plan. There were hundreds of hours spent among the staff, the chair, and myself. There were 3 rounds of review and input with the NVCLE Board of Directors. There was a meeting by conference call with the Board of Governors. There was extensive observations made by the State Bar. And I'd say we went through somewhere around 20 iterations at least, going through the aspects that I've described here today. So accordingly, I'll respectfully express my opinion that this is a solid, realistic business plan. It ties together the objectives that we set forth, both strategic and financial, that'll take the NVCLE into the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Any further questions from justices? Thank you very much for your contribution and your assistance and advice to the CLE board. We appreciate your contribution and your work.
Thank you, Chief Justice.
Okay. Is there anyone else from the CLE board, Ms. Schubach, who would be making a presentation today, or can we move to other folks? No, Your Honor. Okay, great. Is there anybody else who would like to comment? Mr. Digesti?
Chief Justice Hardesty, members of the court, thank you for this opportunity to come before you and give comments on the proposed business plan submitted by the Board of Continuing Legal Education. Our observations were filed by the State Bar of Nevada with the court on October 28, 2015. Certainly not my intent to go through those observations with you. You have that as part of the record. But there are some primary concerns that I would like to highlight for the court this afternoon. And that's based upon numerous hours that were put into this project by the task force commissioned by the state, by the Board of Governors, if you will, and then the Board of Governors themselves in reviewing the proposed business plan. It's been mentioned that the CLE Board filed a response to the observations of the State Bar. As I understand it, the response was filed yesterday with the court. It was received by the clerk of the court on Friday, filed yesterday, and I have not had an opportunity to review the response, nor has the Board of Governors or the CLE task force that was commissioned by the Board of Governors. We've not had the opportunity to review that particular document. So my comments this afternoon are going to be targeted towards the original business plan that was presented in this matter.
Mr. Digesti, given the filing, I think it appropriate for the task force and the board to supplement its report based on the observations, or the response to the observations. There are some pretty material responses, and I don't want to impede any of your comments in any way, but
we would be happy to
in several respects, I think you're probably dealing with some accepted changes by the CLE board based on the suggestions made by the Board of Governors. So, but you proceed as you want to, but I would expect we would extend the time for comment for the Board of Governors to respond to that observation.
Thank you.
Those responses.
Appreciate it. I think commentary by Ms. Hubach earlier this afternoon, I think, is very telling. There have been a good number of hours put into this project by everyone. The commission, Blue Ribbon Commission, that was initiated by Chief Justice Hardesty, the task force representing the Board of Governors, the Board of Governors, the CLE board, and a number of other people. So it's been really a big, big project. And I'm happy to report that it seems like everybody was working together. Even though we might be seated on opposite sides of the courtroom, we are working together and we have a common goal in mind here, and I think we're all in it for the same reasons. And I thank Ms. Hubach for making that representation to the court. I think it's important that everybody understand that this task is a serious one. It's being taken seriously by all parties as well as should be.
I prefer to view the seating arrangement today as the bride's side and the groom's side.
You know, Chief Justice Chair, just so you know, I rode down on the plane this morning with Jenny Hubach, and we didn't sit together on the plane either. So I don't want you to draw any negative inference. But missed out. Anyway. Attorney's fees is one area that we have some question. And it's our understanding that during the transition period, whatever that period is, it might be a year, there is going to be some additional fees, we believe, incurred by the attorneys in this case. They would still be subject to paying their $40 annual CLE fee. And I think we can all safely assume that if there is a $5 charge to the providers for each credit hour, that they are going to pass that cost on to the attorneys. So now, during this transition period, however long, let's assume it's a year, instead of paying $40 a year, these attorneys are going to be paying $100. $5 per credit hours times 12 credit hours a year. And that's a concern, obviously, of the Board of Governors. We have to take the feelings of the membership and we have to consider their objectives and their complaints. And while it may seem a minimal increase to many of us, I submit that there's a number, I would assume, of practicing lawyers that are suffering financially, and to place another additional burden on top of them financially could be problematic, and that is a concern of the Board of Governors. The attorney noncompliance is another area that raises some questions. It's been discussed here this afternoon to a certain extent, and I would like to think that the State Bar and the CLE Board share the same goal, and that goal is one of increasing compliance by the attorneys with the mandatory CLE requirements. As stated in the business plan, I believe, the CLO Board is, and I don't think it's a surprise to anybody, fundamentally dependent on attorneys' noncompliance. They make a lot of money based upon that noncompliance. And I guess we have to kind of ask ourselves, what's the purpose of the CLE? If attorneys can buy their way and get out of jail free by paying a fee, doesn't that really kind of defeat the purpose of the mandatory CLE requirements in the first place? We see that as a problem. It's a concern that I think we need to discuss. And the State Bar honestly feels that the financial dependency that the CLE Board has is contrary to the stated goal of the CLE Board. And I don't want to use the word conflict, but I don't know any other way to describe it. It's something that needs, I think, and I think the Board of Governors and the State Bar of Nevada, some additional discussion, and we need to think about that.
Mr. DeGiusti, this was a significant issue that the Blue Ribbon Committee discussed. There has been a perpetual problem of lawyers in this state simply paying these late fees as a cost of doing business. That was language that was used to our committee. And I think any incentive, whether it be higher fees, risks of being held for violation of misconduct, are efforts that the committee talked about and recommended be evaluated. But I do think that the board has tried since 2001 with the revisions to the rules to try to diminish the amount of late filing fees and its dependency on that. It hasn't worked because lawyers simply ignore the CLE and pay the fee. It's cheaper to do it. And I think the biggest defect that came out of the Blue Ribbon Commission study is the very point that Justice Gibbons referenced earlier, that people can simply pay the fee, not do the CLE, and they do it year after year, and it's the same people, and I don't remember the numbers, maybe Eric does, but it was some 300 or 400 lawyers who are perpetual in this. So I think it's a shared concern, but in the meantime, it seems to persist until there's some major rule changes
And I think,
that address that.
Respectfully, Your Honor, I think maybe that's where this needs to go eventually, is to put more teeth into potential sanction, if you will, for noncompliance.
Well, wouldn't the recommendation, Ms. Schubach indicated that one of the recommendations is to not let them buy their way out. They would still be responsible for completing their CLE requirements. In addition to the late fees and the other fees.
Yeah, that would be terrific, but I'm not sure under the current rules that that's an alternative. I think the way the rules read, and I'm shooting from the hip here, so bear with me. I don't mean to misquote anything. That Justice Gibbons hit the nail on the head. You pay your money, you buy your way out of the CLE requirement.
Mm-hmm.
And if they have that escape hatch, then I think something needs to be done by way of a rule change somewhere to tighten that up and preclude that from happening.
Well, yeah, and that's my understanding, is that there was a fix for that, they'd still be required to complete the CLE. If I'm incorrect, I'm sure somebody will correct me.
Anyway, I just wanted to share that with the court because that is obviously a concern of the Board of Governors, the State Bar of Nevada. The third item is what we refer to as cost control measures. In line with increasing attorney compliance, the State Bar would like to see cost control measures implemented to ensure that the operational expenses can be met absent penalty fees and without any drawdown from the CLE board reserves. In other words, we want to make sure that if they're going to be operating, they can do it, and that there's a good revenue source to do it without necessarily relying upon and being dependent upon attorney's fees for their noncompliance. That's a concern. The allocation of reserves is another area that we discussed. The Nevada CLE Board has set as a priority the intended purpose for its reserves, including establishing, they haven't done this, this is a State Bar of Nevada suggestion, that the Nevada CLE Board set as a priority the intended purpose of its reserves, including establishing an operating reserve and setting a restricted reserve of $500,000 during the transition period, as well as developing a plan for any anticipated reserve drawdown. The State Bar supports, as an option for use of excess reserves, funding legal aid services in Nevada using a formula for distribution that may be developed or adopted by the Access to Justice Commission. Just circling back for a moment to the cost control measures, it is a suggestion or recommendation to the court that perhaps during this transition period that the CLE Board hold off entering into contracts and agreements or hiring any additional staff which might be needed to implement the provider-based model until such time that the business plan is further developed. The last item that I would like to touch on this afternoon is governance. Currently, the CLE Board governance structure, the State Bar supports the approach offered or outlined by the Blue Ribbon Commission for the appointment of CLE Board members to include a hybrid of appointments made by the State Bar, Board of Governors, and the court. We support that, and I believe it's outlined in the report of the Blue Ribbon Commission. And in addition, the State Bar requests that the court consider term limits for service on the CLE Board, and that be included within the Commission's recommendations. Again, thank you for this opportunity and the time to appear before you here today to discuss something that's obviously very important. It's been very time-consuming, and I think we're all here for the same reason. And with that, I will sit down and be quiet. Thank you.
I have some questions. I hope that when you read the response that and you make your reply to the response, that you cover a couple issues. One that Ms. Schubach talked about, talking about specialization, where a criminal lawyer can't take an estate planning course. When I was Chief Justice, I talked to a lot of law firms about hiring, since we have a situation where we have a lot of people coming into the bar, even though we have the lowest pass rate in the country. We have a bunch of new lawyers who are opening firms, especially in Clark County. And I think that it's way out of line for anybody to try to second guess why somebody would take a CLE course. It may be that they're general practitioners. I was one for a number of years. I'm sure there are still many in the rurals and in the Washoe area. And we're having more and more general practitioners here in Las Vegas to make a living. So I would hope that you respond to that issue that Ms. Schubach raised about the board overseeing what CLE courses people take. Secondly, I'd like the State Bar to make a finding on whether a 70-year-old person should have to take CLE or can be exempt. I think you should come forward and say it to my constituency of those that have been practicing law for a long time and are members of the judiciary as to where the State Bar stands on this issue. And also on timeframes. We were talking about you can't buy your way out of CLE. So somebody in March decides that they're going to pay the fine, but now they have to do the 12 hours. Well, then they have to do the 12 hours for next year, too. So they're doing 24 hours. And I think that the time frame for those the 300 lawyers that were smart enough to be able to do this over the years should be fair. And I think these are issues that the State Bar needs to respond to, because you represent the same type of people that I represent and that the CLE board represents. So I'm hoping that you respond to those issues, at least for me, to be able to vote on how I'll handle this ADKT. And I'm very interested to hear the State Bar's response to those particular issues. And I agree that the other issues you raised are substantial issues that I will take a close look at when I get your response. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Digesti? All right, thank you, Mr. Digesti. We appreciate your input.
Thank you.
Any other individuals in Las Vegas wanting to make comment to the court?
No question.
Why don't we wait just a moment, Ms. Schubach? Hi.
May it please the Court, Your Honor, Mr. Chief Justice, Justices, and distinguished members, attendees today. My name is Damon Diaz, and I present to you before you today on behalf of the Clark County Bar Association. We filed a limited response, again, to the September report filed by the committee, and our comments for your consideration, without going through them in their entirety. We find ourselves, even based on the comments today, in a limited exception. The Clark County Bar Association asks that you read our comments and consider a situation where a nonprofit organization such as ours provides low-cost CLE credits. We charge $25 per credit hour. I looked at the September report, and it looks like the average cost per hour is about $115. Our organization provides service to the greater community, as well as collegiality for attorneys. If our ability to provide low-cost CLE credits is in jeopardy, then it limits our ability to maintain our membership, which then limits our ability to fund and to provide services for some of our local organizations, including sponsoring law school events and other events locally. So we submit for you, and for the record, you consider a nonprofit, low-fee CLE organization like ours when you consider the fee structure that is proposed, and that is the fee charge per hour and the annual registration fee, and we ask for a waiver of that.
Did you miss the comments by Ms. Schubach at the commencement, or did those comments not address your concern?
I think they left us out just on the edge. I believe that the intent of current status is to not charge for nonprofit organizations who do not charge for CLE. And with the Clark County Bar Association as a 501c6, we do in fact charge a minimal amount, albeit $25 per credit hour. So I think we find ourselves on the outside looking in at that exception.
What would be your proposal?
Based upon the services that we provide, we're looking for either a waiver for 501c6 nonprofit bar association members like ours. I know it's very specific, but some consideration of the services we provide to the legal community, and perhaps a waiver of the per hour fee. In our response, I think we suggested maybe looking at a cap on the amount you can charge per hour, which you would still qualify for a waiver of the per hour fee, at least for CLE.
So
And
you would, I mean, you could put in an exemption for 501c6 so long as it doesn't charge more than $30 an hour or something along those lines.
yes,
Would you be so kind as to get in touch with the Washoe Bar and the Elko Bar and any other bars and maybe come with one proposal from all of you is to protect, because we're protecting our own when we protect the bar associations.
yes, Your
When
Honor.
you're our own, you're us.
I'd be glad to, Your Honor.
So if you would just put something in writing to us so we have it when we vote,
Will do.
if you get in touch with them.
Again, I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz, for your presentation. Thanks for being here. Any other comments in Las Vegas from members in the audience? Ms. Schubach, you did want to make an additional comment. I guess now would be a good time to do it if nobody else has any other comments. Okay?
Thank you, Your Honor. And with respect to the bar associations, that has been of great concern to the board. So our intention was to look at a different structure for them. If they are charging, how much are they charging? And if they're not charging a lot, then we believe that they should be considered for a waiver on a case-by-case basis. So I didn't want the court to think that we have completely put them out in the lurch, because that's not the idea. Nonprofits, governmental agencies, we're very in tune with the fact that these folks are operating with very little funding, and they need all the help they can get. And with this fee-sponsored model, they could get hurt, so we want to make sure they're protected. And then just a couple of comments with respect to President Digesti, and that is, again, we apologize for the lateness of getting our response, but I think when you do review our response to their observations, you'll see that we did address each and every one and incorporated a great deal of their suggestions into our own. So a lot of what has been addressed may have already been addressed, but they're just not aware of it. With respect to the ultimate goal, of course, our ultimate goal is to increase compliance. Yes, right now a lot of our funding is dependent upon non-compliant attorneys, but we would very much like to see a point where we're not doing that. And that's the reason why the new business plan, to put the onus on the providers, they're the ones that are making the money off of the attorneys, have them fund the operation so that we can continue to do an effective job and ensure quality education and ensure compliance. That is a joint goal of the CLE board and I think the State Bar. So I felt compelled to make a comment on that because, again, we don't want to be financially dependent upon these folks. But as we've considered before, and our board has discussed this infinitum, we try everything we can to get these people to comply. Staff has for years been making phone calls to each and every person that you see on petition, trying to get them off. Board members do the same. Try to convince these people, go do your CLE. You're non-compliant. You're in danger of losing your license. And we found over the years that even doing that, while we do get this significant portion of them off, there comes a point in time where staff can't keep babysitting. And Your Honor pointed that out to us during the commission meetings. You know, enough is enough. We're all adults. We're licensed attorneys. We know the rules. We need to comply. And it's pretty simple. And the steps that we've taken have made it even easier for the attorneys to comply. And the point is well taken about, maybe we shouldn't be looking at what they're doing if they're GP people. I agree with that. We see the same group every year the next 2 weeks. You can tell they're not GP. They're just picking, okay, I'm going to do this now. Which at least give them credit, they're doing something. But again, that's outside our goal of trying to keep people educated in the area of practice so that they're better serving their clients. So again, I certainly don't want the court or the State Bar to think that our business is to generate income from non-compliant attorneys. Our number one goal is to get, if we could, 100% compliance. But I just don't think we'll ever get to that point. But all we can do is keep trying.
What's your time frame for 16? Like January is when we usually get the little card in the mail. Is that still going to go out with the $40 assessment?
It will this year.
So nothing's going to be changed as far as what we usually do in January?
Not until we change into the new system and get rid of the $40 and go completely paperless. Oh, and answer to the other question earlier, the attorney not only has to do, like you said, the last year's credits, but they have to do this year's credits, plus if they let it go to a certain point, Then they're in a situation where we changed our rules to require them to do more credits. So things have been done over the years under the court's guidance to put more teeth into the enforcement and trying to wake people up. But like I said, you just issued the order that we just received, suspending 500. I mean, it's a lot. And percentage-wise, again, we're not even close to 97%, but that's where we'd like to be.
I just want to make sure that we're protective of the state bar programs, the Clark County Bar, the Washoe Bar. I just attended the appellate judge's educational institute in Washington, D.C., and I got like 11 hours of credit, and I'm sure that they can afford to pay to come to let our I had there were a couple of our staff attorneys there, and I was there, and certainly there were other lawyers that do appeals. The Conference of Appellate Lawyers, Cal, were there also. So, and NBI, I know I get those documents all the time. And like some of us go to West Coast Casualty every year, you know, with the CD stuff, and these people can afford to pay. They charge a fortune for those CLEs, but certainly I don't want to see the state bar, or especially our Clark County Bar Association, which struggles anyway, to have to worry about paying for CLE, because they do a good job of making sure there's lots of CLE for lots of people.
Correct, Your Honor, and that's our goal, is to get the people that are in the profit-making business to pay for the services that we are providing. Because it takes time to review their applications, make sure they're in compliance, make sure they're good quality, and there's no reason why they shouldn't pay a fee for that. It doesn't have to be a lot, it should be reasonable, but they should be the ones funding the work that we do.
Okay,
I do have a question,
Yes,
Chief,
just
if I may. I just want to make sure I understood correctly that under the new plan, there is no buyout.
Correct.
If they're not in compliance, they'll be charged their extension fees, their late fees, but they'll still be required to do the CLE.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And we also want to propose something a little stricter, and that's going to be maybe two or the third time they go to discipline.
Right.
More teeth.
Okay, anything further, Ms. Schubach?
No, Your Honor, thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Anybody else in Carson City, in Las Vegas, who wanted to make a comment? Mr. Oberstein, you were on the committee, the Blue Ribbon Committee. Do you have anything you'd like to add or share with the court?
No, Your Honor, I think you covered it all.
Okay, great. Thanks for your service on the committee. We appreciate that very much, and Mr. Pocker as well, who represented the State Bar on that committee. Are there any persons in in Carson City who would like to address the court on this administrative docket? Okay, apparently not. With that, Mr. Digesti, Ms. Farmer, would January 15th be a reasonable time for the Board of Governors to respond to the CLE Board's response?
Your Honor, the only question is we were asked to have the Board of Governors review the issue, and that would be a Board of Governors discussion. Our next Board of Governors meeting is until the 20th of January.
Okay.
We'll schedule a meeting for the court, Your Honor, January 20th.
So,
It would be appropriate, whatever we come up with, that it be reviewed by the governors, so maybe sometime shortly after that.
okay, then how about the 31st of January? Is that reasonable? I think that still would afford the CLE Board adequate time and the court adequate time to still meet a July 31st implementation date if that was going to be endorsed by the court, would it not?
I believe so, Your Honor.
Okay, great. All right, then, thanks everyone for your participation in this effort and for your cooperation. Anything else from anybody? Okay, then we'll close this public hearing and leave it only remaining to the response from the Board of Governors by the 31st of January 2016. Thank you.